Well, good afternoon. Welcome back. Now, before the break, we were talking about the higher and lower pleasure of John Stuart Mill. So, there we had seen that he believed that the higher pleasure and lower pleasure are two types of pleasure which differs from each other in terms of quality, not quantity. So, higher pleasure is the pleasure of mind and lower pleasure is the pleasure of body. So, next important thing we will talk about now is that how is it that both of these two pleasures how do we know which pleasure is high and which pleasure is low. So, Mill talks about that also in a way. Write down further, change the paragraph and then have to write further. Higher pleasure can be differentiated from the lower ones by taking the opinion of the experts. By taking the opinion of the experts. So this is what he says next. He says that higher pleasure and lower pleasure can be understood from different from each other. So how can we differentiate between the two? Then he says the experts are the people who can actually help us in that. Now, who are the experts next? Write down further. Experts are the people who have an equal and extensive experience of both types of pleasure. Experts are the people who have an equal and extensive experience of both types of pleasure. Write down further, anyone who has such an experience will automatically get the ability to intuitively differentiate. Intuitively differentiate between the higher and the lower pleasure. And their opinion should be respected. So this is how he defined the experts. Who are the experts now? Now experts are not mysterious people. Experts are anybody, any of us can become experts. Because the problem is that most of us, the common people, those people who enjoy, for example, some of us enjoy the lower pleasure like Honey Singh's music, but they enjoy only that. They never think of going to that level. But those people who enjoy the higher pleasure like Beethoven, for example, they never enjoy the Honey Singh. They will say Honey Singh's music will be a bad music maybe. Now, but there are some people who enjoy this also and who enjoy that also. Such people who have equal enjoyment of both of that, equal exposure to both of that, experience of both of that, then well, such people are called experts. So experts are the people whose mind get trained in such a manner that intuitively means what? Through intuition. What is an intuition? Intuition we will discuss in a later class in more detail, but intuition we can simply say is basically ability of the person to arrive at a conclusion without any logical reasoning. So without analyzing it logically or rationally, if you think that something is right and wrong, then that is called intuition. A sort of feeling that you have about something. So that is what we call the intuition. So such people who have an equal and extensive experience of both types of pleasure, their mind is trained in such a manner that they have a natural intuition to decide, to know what is higher and what is lower pleasure, and they can be trusted. Their opinion can be taken into consideration, should be accepted by all of us. That is what expertise is, and that is what he suggests. Now, but this creates a problem in the Bentham's theory of Mill's theory, as we will see next. So change the paragraph and then after write further. Because of this, Mill's theory is often criticized as Mill's theory is often criticized as being elitist, in which the opinion and preference of the experts, in which the opinions and preference of the experts matter more than that of the non-experts. This reduces the objectivity and the non-judgmental character of utilitarianism, which Bentham valued so much. So this is where the problem comes up in the Bentham, both of these two people, Bentham and Mill. So because of this problem, you can say this idea of experts, many critics of John Stuart Mill says that his theory has become more elitist. Elitist means what? That some people become elite and others are the common people. So in this case, the opinion and preference of the experts matter more, and we, the common people, our opinions matter less. But remember, in Bentham's theory, one of the important aspects that Bentham focused on was that everybody's opinion must matter equally. So suppose, for example, there is a person who says that, suppose you are a big fan of, say, Honey Singh, and you say that Honey Singh is a great musician, and an expert tells you that no, it is a bad music, it is lower pleasure. And you start saying that how dare you say it is bad music, it is a great music. Now whose opinion matters more, yours or the experts? Well, Bentham will say everybody's opinion matters more. Now Mill will say no, experts' opinion matters more and yours matter less. So because of that, you can say it becomes a less objective theory, less non-judgmental. Now there is a judgment that okay, such people's opinion becomes higher and some other people's opinion becomes less important. So everybody that was equal in the eye of ethics in Bentham's theory is no longer valid here. So that is why you can see many supporters of Bentham, well, do not agree with John Stuart Mill on this ground that they are higher and the lower pleasure. So this controversy is still there in the field of utilitarianism, that which type of pleasure, well, is good. Do we have only one type of pleasure as Bentham said, or are there two types of pleasure as Mill is now supporting? Suppose, long ago I heard a story, beautiful story. My grandfather had told me that story. Now, in ancient time, what happened that there was a saint was there, a seer, old man. He was going through a jungle early in the morning. In the beginning of the jungle itself, he saw a young man sleeping under a tree. Now, this old man looked at this person and he felt very sad that such a beautiful morning it is, and he is wasting that sleeping like this. Old people often think like this when they see the young people enjoying their morning sleep. But this old man did not do anything. He moved ahead on his path. Now, in the evening when you are coming back, then he saw the same young man sleeping in the same position, same tree, even in the evening. Now, this old man got very irritated and angry that whole day he kept on sleeping like this. He woke him up and asked him that, young man, do you know what you have done today? You have wasted one complete day of your life. During this day, you could have done something more productive, more useful. The young man asked, what do you think I could have done? Give me suggestion. Then old man told him, you could have cut the tree under which you are sleeping and sold the tree in the market. You could have earned some money. Then what? The young man asked. Then after tomorrow you might have hired more people and cut more tree. Then after what? You could have started a business of timber. Then after what? You could have started a business of furniture. Then after what? You could have earned lots of money. Then after what? You could have made a big palace house for yourself. Then after what? You could have married a pretty girl after that. Then after what? He kept on asking like this. At the end of it, the old man got irritated. What do you mean by then after what? You could have enjoyed the life after that. To which the young man said, what do you think I am doing right now? So I am still now enjoying. So why do you disturb me? Let me see let me enjoy my life. So after doing all of these things, I can still, only thing that I have to do is to enjoy the life. I am doing that right now. Why do you disturb me? That is the question. So same question that comes up that I asked you earlier. You can enjoy it today also by bunking the classroom and sleeping and walking around and doing gossip and having a cup of coffee, etc. But you can make a lots of sacrifice and clear the UPSC exam and become an IAS officer. Then after what would you do? Why do you want to become an IAS officer? To enjoy the life. Now, do you think that there is a difference between this enjoyment that you can get today by eating a tasty food and watching good film, for example, and that enjoyment that you will get after clearing UPSC exam and become an IAS officer and having great career after that? Bentham will say they are same. It is just the quantity that matter, that will be higher quantity, bigger quantity, and this is a smaller quantity. Mill will say that no, they are two different things. You cannot compare the two. This is lower pleasure and that would be higher pleasure. So think about it yourself, that where does your conscience lie? What do you think that which of the two happiness is, well, which of the two opinion is more acceptable to you? So that is the idea of John Stuart Mill about the two types of pleasure. One small thing further I will make you to write here, write down further. Mill believed that higher pleasure is more desirable. Higher pleasure is more desirable than the lower pleasure. Higher pleasure is more desirable than the lower pleasure. Thus, in order to ensure that people enjoy the higher pleasure, they must be given enough training and exposure. They must be given enough training and exposure. For this reason, he supported universal education. For this reason, he supported universal education. Now, this is one important consequence of this idea, more practical consequence of this idea, because as you can see from the previous discussion, you can imagine, you can appreciate yourself that Mill will say that the higher pleasure is of course more desirable, more wanted, but higher pleasure is not something that can be enjoyed by everybody. Higher pleasure can be enjoyed only and only when you get enough training, experience, practice, etc. So for this reason, he suggested that everybody in the society should be given exposure to the higher pleasure, some training, some experience for that. And for this reason, he was a supporter of universal education. Because if you look at education, then education has been a very interesting or controversial topic in the history of every world, every society. Because everywhere in the world, education had always been considered to be the prerogative of a small group of people. In traditional India, for example, only a small group of upper caste people used to get education. 90% people never got any education at all. In Europe also, very small group of, you can see, the upper class people, they used to get education. 90% of the people never got any education at all. It was thought that these are the lower people, lower class people, lower caste people, they are not capable of getting the education. Education is only for the intelligent people, upper class people, upper caste people. So they can never get education, their mind is not evolved enough to get the education. But Mill was strongly against that. Mill said that everybody is capable of getting education. So it is a duty of the government to ensure that everybody should get exposure to enjoy anything. And he believed that if the people start, those people who get education or exposure, if they start enjoying the higher pleasure, then automatically they will stop enjoying the lower pleasure. They enjoy the lower pleasure only because they are not exposed to the higher pleasure. So it is important for us to lift people from the lower to the higher pleasure by giving enough exposure to them. So lower pleasure will automatically be out after that. Nobody will like it, nobody will enjoy it. So this is what he says. So today nobody enjoys if somebody is being killed by a hungry lion, because you have started enjoying something better perhaps. Let people enjoy something better so that something bad nobody will enjoy. This is what Mill said. That is the duty of the government. And it is actually seen that educated people often do not commit such highly educated people, more educated people often do not commit such acts which gives them the lower pleasure, like for example, well, crime and all. I was reading about it a few times, some times ago, that in Tihar jail in Delhi, for example, that all those criminals who are, I can say, accused of some violent crime, then almost 70% of the criminals who are accused of some violent crime like murder, rape, etc., they are illiterate people. In Tihar jail it was found 70% of them are around illiterate people. So educated people, they also commit crime, but their crime is more different crime. They commit more financial crime, maybe corruption, maybe. So that is, so the physical crime where somebody suffers because of the crime of somebody else is mostly done by the less educated people in general. So idea is that if Mills is correct, then if you educate these people, then perhaps we can reduce the crime rate also in the society. Educated society has less crime. So because people do not enjoy it, because crime also gives a lower pleasure. So people who started enjoying the other things in life, then after nobody will enjoy the crime. That is one way to make a better society, a happier society, according to John Stuart Mill. So for that reason, he supported things like universal education, education for all. He was among the first important philosophers of that age who supported this idea of universal education, that everybody in the society must be properly educated. And that became one of the important focus of every government after, in the more recent time. So that is how we can understand his idea of higher and the lower pleasure. Let us see, I think there is a question. Nimai, sir, a lot of people go to Himalaya for dhyan meditation to attain higher pleasure and they never get married. So my question is it possible to live with higher pleasure only according to this theory, or is it necessary to have both higher and the lower pleasure? Again, Mill will not say that not getting marriage will give you a higher pleasure. Mill will not say that we should not enjoy the tasty food or sex, for example, in marriage, etc. Marriage can also give you a higher pleasure, that sense of commitment that people have in the marriage. About marriage, we will talk about in the day after tomorrow's class. What is the ethics of marriage? Marriage is not only about sex or physical pleasure, biological pleasure. Marriage is also about satisfaction that the people get in a stable relationship. So not marrying alone does not give you higher pleasure. Mill said that we can get higher pleasure even in that. So marriage has nothing to do with the nature of the pleasure that it can possibly give. Next question, Madan Saha. Sir, what is universal education? Universal education basically means education for all. Everybody in the society should get the education and government should ensure that. Universal means everybody gets it. Next question, Mandeep. Sir, how could universal basic income be justified from the ideas of Mill? Well, you can simply justify the universal basic income may allow people to lead a happier life, maybe even the poorest of the poor people. Though about universal basic income, we'll talk about in some other class later on also, that what can be the other justification for that. But Mill's justification could be that universal basic income will give some guarantee to certain income to the people that will make them to, well, get better pleasure, maybe happier life, maybe. So that is what this. So this is all about the John Stuart Mill's idea, and this is all about utilitarianism, the second a very important and influential theory of ethics. Now we will talk about the third important theory of ethics, another very influential and important theory, and that is called libertarianism. Another important theory of ethics, that is called libertarianism. Now libertarianism, as we will see shortly in today's class and most of tomorrow's class also, that libertarianism in comparison to the other theories of ethics that we have discussed in our class and that we will discuss in the future also, this theory is a comparatively new theory of ethics. Quite a new theory in the sense that it is just for the last 50 years, starting from 1970s and then 1980s and 90s and 2 decades of this century, that this theory has become extremely influential in the world, including in our country. So it's a very new theory in comparison to the other theory that we have. And in our class, we are not following a chronological order. We are following a logical order. We are not following chronological order because the ancient Greek philosopher like Aristotle, we will discuss towards the end of the philosophy part, towards the end of our course here, and this modern philosophy we are discussing just in between, in the middle, because logically I believe that libertarianism should come just after John Stuart Mill. That will help us to maintain a sort of continuity in our discussion, logical continuity in our discussion. So because of that, we are taking up this new theory just after utilitarianism here. We'll see the logic behind that. Why are we discussing this theory now? So this theory is a very new theory in comparison. If you look at some of the philosophers associated with the idea of libertarianism, then the most important philosopher from this topic are the people. So the most important philosopher associated with this theory would be are the people like Robert Nozick or Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, etc., etc. Milton Friedman. So today you know that some great theory of philosophy of ethics is normally not developed by one single individual like Bentham or Mill. Today a number of people talk about similar ideas and their idea takes shape of one theoretical framework. So there are a number of other thinkers are also there who are considered to be the libertarians, but the most important one of them are people like, these are the people, Robert Nozick, or the professor of philosophy at Harvard University, Friedrich Hayek, an economist, Milton Friedman, an economist. Both of them have got a Nobel Prize in economics. So some of the most important thinkers in this area are these people. Libertarianism, as we will see shortly in our class today and tomorrow also, that libertarianism, along with being a theory of ethics, it is also a theory of politics. And among the politicians, the most important libertarian politician in the world were the people like Ronald Reagan and in America and Margaret Thatcher in Britain. So though there are large number of other politicians also are there who are libertarian by their inclination, but these two, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, were the most important libertarian politician because, well, both of them rose to the peak of the political power in their country. Reagan became the president of America and one of the most influential president in the Second World War, post Second World War era. Similarly, Margaret Thatcher also became the Prime Minister of Britain and the most influential Prime Minister of Britain in the post-World War era. So both of these two people were extremely influential politicians, and both of them, they tried to implement the ideas of libertarianism into their state policy when they become the political head of their countries. So they are the important people again. In fact, the impact of these people's ideas on their policy was so strong that I remember one interesting anecdote, that when Margaret Thatcher became the Prime Minister of Britain, then when the first cabinet meeting was going on, then she brought a book written by Friedrich Hayek, one of the most important book in the libertarian theory, well known as the Constitution of Liberty. Now, she brought that book and she put that book at the center of her table and told all her cabinet colleagues that now onwards, this book is going to be my constitution. So, this book is going to be my because Britain does not have a written constitution. So, she declared to her cabinet colleagues that this book now onwards, this book is going to be my constitution, and I am going to run my administration on the basis of principles written down in this book. So that was the type of impact of the ideas of people like Friedrich Hayek was there on the policies of people like Margaret Thatcher. So they were very important philosophers, and their ideas had a strong impact on the policies of the people like Reagan and Thatcher. If you look at India, then almost 10 years ago, before the 2014 election, then there was election was about to happen, then there was one politician was there who was the prospective prime ministerial candidate of a big political party in India, about whom people often said at that time that if he becomes the Prime Minister of India, he might become a libertarian Prime Minister. Can you tell me who that person could be? I hope some of you who read the newspapers and all regularly for the last 10 years may be aware of him. Well, he was Narendra Modi. So, Narendra Modi at that time, he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, and he was the Prime Ministerial candidate of the BJP at that time. And so, the national media had started taking interest in his ideas and policies, etc. So, many libertarian people in India had said that Narendra Modi, if he becomes the Prime Minister of India, he might become a libertarian Prime Minister. So much so that people like Swaminathan S. Akhilesh Iyer, I hope that you may have heard the name of Swaminathan Iyer. He is a well-known economist today. He writes often in the newspapers like Times of India. Every Sunday he writes a column in Times of India called Swanomics. And in Economic Times, so well-known economist in India, economic journalist, economist, whoever you call. So he in his column had number of times, he and many other people have written then that if Modi becomes the Prime Minister of India, he might become Margaret Thatcher of India. Now, that is an interesting comparison. So, in today's class and a little of tomorrow's class also, we will be able to see that when people say that Modi can become the, the Margaret Thatcher of India, then what exactly they meant. And after almost 10 years of Modi rule in India, 9 years more than that, we can now figure out to what extent Modi has been able to fulfill the promise of libertarianism. To what extent he became the Margaret Thatcher of India. That also you should be able to answer towards the end of this theory. So the idea is that this theory is extremely influential theory in modern time, including in our country. So let us talk about what exactly this idea is and what this idea tells us about a society, a good society, according to it. So write down first of all, according to the libertarians, every individual should have an absolute and fundamental right of liberty, to do whatever he or she wants, absolute and fundamental right of liberty to do whatever he or she wants, unless and until he does not aggress against someone else. unless and until he or she does not aggress against someone else. Unless and until he does not aggress against someone else. Now that is the first important thing. The idea here is that these people will say, this is how we can start, that every person should have an absolute and fundamental right. These three are the very important words. We will see the meaning of these three words shortly. Every individual should have an absolute and fundamental right of liberty to do whatever that person wants, with only one exception, unless and until that person aggresses against someone else. So idea here is that aggression is the only ground on which we can restrict the liberty of somebody else. Except for aggression, there is no other legitimate ground on which we can force somebody's liberty out. We can limit the liberty of someone else. Now, what is the meaning of the term aggression? They gave a very clear-cut definition of aggression also. So, let us see what exactly aggression means in this theory. Write down further. They define aggression as the use of force. They define aggression as the use of force or a threat of the use of force. Or a threat of the use of force against the person or property of use of force or a threat of the use of force against the person or property of someone else. Against the person or property of someone else. Now, this is the exact meaning of the term aggression in this theory. Aggression means here that the use of force or a threat of use of force against the person or property of someone else. So, aggression essentially means here two important things. First of all, aggression means if there is a physical harm to somebody else. If there is a physical harm to somebody else. So, if there is a physical harm by action, if I am physically harming somebody else, or if I am giving a threat of a physical harm to somebody else, then that will be an act of aggression, and on that ground I can be put in jail. My liberty can be curtailed. That is one meaning of the term liberty. And second meaning of the term liberty is the violation of someone's property rights. Violation of somebody's property rights. So, if you violate somebody's property right, or if you threaten the violation of somebody's property right, then that will be an act of aggression. So, suppose for example, if I snatch your pen without your permission, or if I threaten that I am going to do that, then that will be an aggression. Or when I barge into your house, for example, your office, for example, your factory, for example, without your permission, then or if I threaten you that I am going to do that, then that will be an act of aggression. And on that ground, I can be put in jail. On that ground, my liberty can be restricted. So, they are the two important defining things: the physical harm or a threat of physical harm, rather four things. The aggression means four things. One is physical harm, second is a threat of a physical harm, third is the violation of somebody's property right, and fourth is a threat of the violation of somebody's property right. So, these are the important grounds on which is defined, in the definition of aggression, and these are the grounds on which the liberty of a person can be curtailed, it can be restricted, it can be limited. Otherwise, there is no other legitimate ground is there on which somebody's liberty can be restricted. This is what these people will say. So, in a way, what we are saying here is that as a normal human being, libertarian human being in a society, we have only one universal ethical obligation. And what is that ethical obligation? We call that as the obligation of non-aggression, which means no physical harm and no violation of somebody's property right. So, we should all make a commitment in order to make a good society, that a moral society. We should all make a commitment that we will not, we can say, harm others physically or threaten. We will not violate others' property right or threaten. So that is the only obligation that we have. We call that as NAP, non-aggression principle. Remember this word that we are going to use that a number of times later on. NAP or non-aggression principle. So non-aggression principle is the only principle that is universally applied on every person in the society. Otherwise, except for non-aggression principle, there is no other ground on which liberty can be legitimately restricted, liberty can be legitimately curtailed. So that is the idea of liberty that these people are talking about. Now, next important question that comes up is that if they reject the, you can say, if they, this type, they also talk about liberty, but they were not the excuse me. So they are talking about liberty, of course, but these people are not the first people in history who talked about liberty. Before them also, there were a large number of other people also who talked about similar about type of liberty in the society. So what is the difference? So the question is that what is the difference between this liberty that we are going to talk about in this class and other liberties that earlier people talked about, like for example, so for example that of John Stuart Mill. We have already talked about Mill's liberty. So why is it that, how is it that this theory is different, for this idea of liberty is different from the Mill's idea? So that is what we will talk about next. But before that, let me see that I think there is a question that I think we should take it. One question about Vidisha Sarkar said, India is a liberal country, then why is it the country going towards introducing UCC? We'll talk about that in this theory later on, Vidisha. Other question is, sir, why most of the thinkers come from the Europe, America or developed country, but not as much from India or the subcontinent? See, all of these ideas have been developed for the last 300 years maybe. And during last 300-400 years, you can see that the most of the other India etc. were under the European rule, where here intellectual growth was hampered significantly. We did have great thinkers in the ancient time. I did talk about Mahavir, for example. So that's why I told you that almost 2,400 years before John Stuart Mill, Mahavir has talked about similar idea. But we are talking about these philosophers because these philosophers created an idea, created a political philosophy on the basis of which our society today is based on. So it is just an accident of history, you can say. Had we been in, you can say, in ancient time, then most of the thinkers might be from India, Buddha or Mahavir or Shankaracharya, Ramanujam, they were the great thinkers. So had we been 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, maybe 2,000 years ago, then we might be talking about the thinkers from this. So that was the time when Europe was in dark age. Isn't it? So that was a golden age for Indian philosophy, maybe golden age for Chinese philosophy, maybe. So that would have been the time when we might have been talking about them. It is just accident of history that today we are here and these ideas are, well, prominent idea. So every, you can say, age has its own time, its own way of expressing the moral philosophy. Today we can say that these philosophers took a lead in explaining that. Remember, ideas are same. Mahavir also talked about similar thing, which Mill is talking about. It is just that we are using a modern language here, modern, can say, society. We are seeing the society. Mahavir did not see the society today. Mahavir was not aware of, Buddha was not aware of social media at all. Isn't it? So we have to talk about the modern ideas. Recent time, you can say for the last few hundred years, most of these philosophers have actually come from the, you can say, these countries itself. But remember, ideas are not Western or Indian. Ideas are universal. Anybody can have the similar ideas anywhere. So I always try to give you some parallel in Indian thought in those things. I did give you a parallel of liberty in the Mahavir's idea, Anekantavad or Shadvad. Later on also we will see the similar thing. But that language, in the old language, today we are looking at a new way of expressing the same old idea. Isn't it? So it's not that these thinkers only came from Europe. These thinkers can be found anywhere. It is just the accident of history that today these philosophers are at the forefront and we have to study them. So next important question that we need to ask is that that how this liberty is different from the other liberties that we had talked about earlier, like for example, John Stuart Mill's liberty. Let's briefly talk about that also. Write down a few lines. Change the paragraph, then after write further. They support liberty, but they support liberty not as a means but they support liberty not as a means to achieve some other end. But they support liberty not as a means to achieve some other end. But for them, liberty was an end, liberty was important as, but for them, liberty was important as an end in itself. Liberty was important as an end in itself. Liberty was important as an end in itself. Liberty is the absolute end of moral argument. Liberty is the absolute end of moral argument. Now, this is another important thing that we need to understand. Idea here is that before we talk about this end or means, let us go back to the Mill's theory first of all. Mill also said, as we have seen earlier, that liberty is important. But why is liberty important? Why should we have liberty in this society? According to Mill, Mill said that if you have liberty, then it will have certain benefits. We have seen in the previous class that Mill talks about 4 important benefits of liberty. He said that if you respect individual liberty, then these are the 4 important benefits that you have. So, liberty has certain benefits. Now, this type of, so in this sense, if you look at it, for a person like John Stuart Mill, liberty was a means. What was the end? Benefits were the end. So, he supported liberty as a means to achieve some other end. Such argument is called utilitarian argument. That is why Mill was a utilitarian philosopher. So, whenever you argue in this manner, you are essentially being a utilitarian person. What is the meaning of that? Well, whenever you support something for the sake of something else, whenever you justify something in the name of something else, then you essentially become a utilitarian person. So, for example, if I ask you, why are you watching this lecture here? If you say that I am watching this lecture because I want to clear the UPSC exam, then your argument here will be a utilitarian argument, because you are justifying your act of being present in this classroom on the ground of its consequence, the utility of the classroom for you. So, whenever you support something for the sake of some other thing, then you are being a utilitarian. That is why Mill did support liberty, but he still was a utilitarian philosopher. He was supporting liberty within the confines of the utilitarian philosophy itself. So, that was the Mill. Now, such argument of utilitarian argument has one big problem. What is the problem in this argument? Problem in this argument is that, suppose for example, so in this argument, liberty is a secondary thing, primary thing is the means. Suppose for example, we are discussing with Mill, and Mill tells us that we should have liberty in the society. Now, if we ask him, why do you think we should have liberty in the society? He will say, these are the benefits of liberty. Now, suppose for example, we tell him that, okay, Mr. Mill, I will give you all these benefits without having liberty also, without having liberty, then can we compromise the liberty in that case? He might possibly say so. So, some people may possibly say, in China, well, benefits are there. Chinese society, somebody had asked this question in the previous class, that in China, let me take up that question. Somebody has, Amit had asked this question. Chinese economy is growing so fast, but same time Chinese people's liberty rank is low compared to other countries. Is it follow the rule of development proportionality to liberty? Exactly. That is where we can now see the flaw in the Mill's idea. So, many people may say that China is having, can say lots of development is there for last few decades. The economic growth is tremendous there, violence is also not that endemic, but even then liberty is not there. So if we can have, you can say benefit or development etc. without liberty, then can we compromise the liberty in that case? Mill might possibly say yes. That was the problem with the Mill's liberty. That Mill's liberty was a means to achieve some other end, but not for the libertarians. Libertarians will say that, well, we don't care for these benefits. If these benefits are there, it's very good. But even if these benefits are not there, then also liberty is so important that we cannot compromise the liberty. Liberty is important for them not as a means to achieve some other end. Liberty is important as an end in itself. It is the absolute end of moral argument. Moral argument does not have to go beyond the liberty. So benefits may or may not be there. In either case, liberty is important. So just think of it. Suppose we can compare India with China. In Chinese society, development is fast, high, but liberty is not there. In India, liberty is comparatively high, but development is not that much. What do you think? Which society is a better society? Which society would you like to live in, India or China? Mill might possibly say, or supporter of Mill might possibly say China is better because their development is much faster. But libertarian will say that no, Indian society is far better than China, because in India we have most basic fundamental principle of ethics better applied than that in China. Liberty is important as an end in itself, not merely as a means to achieve some other end. So that is how this liberty is there. That's why we can say in moral philosophy we often talk about two types of liberty. First liberty we talk about utilitarian liberty like John Stuart Mill, and libertarian liberty like this which we are talking about in this class. What is utilitarian liberty? Utilitarian liberty was the one in which liberty was important as a means. For us now, liberty is important as an end. For utilitarian like Mill, liberty was instrumental. For us now, liberty will be, we can say liberty is absolute and fundamental. For us, liberty is absolute and fundamental. So this is what we will. So that's why I told you these two are the very key words here. So in Mill's theory, liberty was just an instrument to achieve a purpose. But now purpose is not important. It is absolute thing that we must have. Further, we can see that for a person like John Stuart Mill, liberty was a utility. Consequence. For us, liberty is a right. So utilitarians never use the term right. So Mill did talk about liberty, but he did not say that it is right that the people have. He simply said that liberty is beneficial, let's have it. But now we say that liberty is a right that every person should have. Meaning of that we will discuss throughout the course. And finally you can see for a utilitarian like Mill, liberty was a rule. And for us now liberty is a principle. So rule and principle, we have talked about that also in our earlier previous class, that for Mill liberty was just a rule, and rule can have an exception as we have seen. So in some special circumstances Mill may possibly agree to make an exception to the rule of liberty. China may be an exception for him. But for us, liberty is a principle. Principles are, as I told you earlier, principles are exceptionless. So libertarian will say that liberty is such a fundamental principle of ethics that it should never be made an exception of. It is not a rule, it is not a utilitarian construct, it is an absolute moral principle. That is how these two liberties differ from each other, utilitarian liberty and the libertarian's liberty, absolute liberty. So that is the next important thing. Now next important thing that comes, a question that now comes up is that if they reject the idea of benefit as a source of liberty, benefits are no longer important, then why is that for liberty should be there? What is the source of liberty? Well, let's talk about that next. Change the paragraph and then after write further. They support liberty on the basis, on the ground of they support liberty on the ground of their fundamental principle of self ownership. Fundamental principle of self ownership. An individual has, write down further, an individual has a right of liberty because he is the owner of himself, he or she is the owner of himself, and he alone has a property right over himself. And he alone has a property right over himself or herself. Nobody else including the state, or the family, or the community, etc., own an individual. Nobody else, including the state or the family or the community, etc., own an individual. So this is the next important thing. The idea here is that they say here that in order to answer this question, that from where we get the right of liberty, why liberty is there? Well, in order to answer this question, they ask one other fundamental question, that who is the owner of an individual? Who is my owner and who is your owner? And they answer this question by saying that each individual is the owner of himself or herself. So, I am the owner of myself and you are the owner of yourself. I alone have a property right in myself and you alone have a property right in yourself. Nobody else. A state does not own us. Family does not own an individual. Your parents may have given birth to you, but that does not mean that they become your owner. So they can work as a guardian up to certain age, which we will talk about shortly. They can work as a guardian till certain age, but after that, well, you become self-owner, and then after, well, you have liberty because of that. So each individual is the owner of himself. Family does not own us, state does not own us, government does not own us, community does not own us, society does not own us. Individual is owned by himself. So self-ownership is one of the fundamental principles of liberty according to them. Now this idea of self-ownership, if you look at it historically, then perhaps this idea can be found its root. You can find the root of this idea in this concept of self-ownership into the ideas of, well, Enlightenment philosopher, British philosopher John Locke. You must have heard the name of John Locke. I did not discuss his theory in my class much detail because his ideas are somehow you can find parallel in this theory. So John Locke was the person who said that, he is most famous for that quotation that all of you must have heard, that each individual has an absolute and inalienable right of life, liberty and property. Now he defined the relationship between the individual and the state in a much clearer manner, which we are taking up here. Because before him, normally it was said that what is the relationship between the individual and the king, for example, state. Earlier it was thought that state is the supreme, king is the owner of whole kingdom. And we are, what is the role of an individual? Well, we are owned by the king. We are, well, working on the property of the king, land of the king. So property is all of the king. I can work on a piece of land for some time. Well, and produce of that will be of kings. I can take a part of that as retinue. Individual was the secondary and king was the primary. Now, John Locke, inverted that relationship. He said that individual is the owner of himself. So, an individual becomes the owner of himself or his property, inalienable right of life, liberty and property. So, individual is the owner of his life, liberty and property. Now, what is the role of the state now? Role of the state becomes secondary after that. A state or king can only protect the individual liberty, not own the individual, not show an ownership right over the individual. So, this is what this idea of John Locke said. Individual became the earlier king was the center and individual was at the periphery. Now individual became the center and king became at the periphery in that sense. So that is how we can see that the relationship. This is where the source of this idea. That's why we can say that earlier king was supreme. Now king is always secondary. That's why you can say servant, protector. That is why tomorrow if you clear the UPSC exam and you become part of the government, what will be your job? What will be your service in that case? Well, you will become a civil servant. You will become servant. You will not be the master. Who is the master? Well, master is the people, individual. Individual is the master and your job as a civil servant will be to be servant of that person, to serve the people. Prime Minister also sometimes says that I am not a Prime Minister, I am the Prime Servant. Pradhan Mantri nahi, Pradhan Sevak hu. So that is the idea that these people often talk about. The role of the government is to be a servant, not to be the master. Master is always the individual. So that is where the self-ownership comes up, an important idea of liberty. Each individual is the owner of himself. In fact, every other right that you talk about, that flows from the self-ownership right itself. So today we talk about, say, freedom of expression. From where the right of free speech comes up? Well, right of free speech comes from the same self-ownership. I am the owner of myself and I alone can decide what to speak and what not to speak. Similarly, you can say, I have right to religion, for example. From where the right to religion comes up? Well, that from the same self-ownership. I am the owner of myself, so I alone can decide which religion to follow or which religion not to follow, or whether to follow a religion or not. Nobody can force me to follow or unfollow a religion. It's my right now, because I am the. Similarly, you can say, I have a right to work. From where that right comes up? Well, that right comes from the same right that I am the owner of myself, so I alone can decide which work to do and which work not to do. So every other right you talk about, right to movement, for example, right to assembly, for whatever right that you can talk about, every right flows from the same fundamental right, that self-ownership, that individual is the owner of himself, and because of that, all of these rights are, well, subservient to that. All of these rights flow from that. It is the fundamental, most fundamental of all the rights. Every right is a derivative of that fundamental right itself, according to the libertarian principle. Now, this idea of self-ownership, a few years ago, this idea of self-ownership was quite a lot in news in India. Can you think of, there was a case which was being heard, there was a case that was being heard in the Supreme Court about a particular bill that was proposed in the parliament, or passed by the parliament, and with this reference, this term self-ownership had become part of the discussion at that time. Can you think of which case it was? You can think of, you can understand. This case that I am talking about was the Aadhaar bill. Now, Aadhaar bill, when it was passed by the parliament, then it was made compulsory that every Indian must have an Aadhaar card. Now, some people challenged that bill. One ground of the challenge was that when you are making an Aadhaar card, then you have to give your iris impression or you have to give your thumb impression. But suppose, for example, so in this case, these petitioners say that my iris impression or my thumb impression is my property. Government cannot forcefully take my property. Can say force me to give my property to the government. That's a violation of my self-ownership right. Now, as a response to that, I will say, in a very stupid argument, I would say from the libertarian point of view, that the then Attorney General of India, Mukul Rohatgi, said in Supreme Court, and Arun Jaitley also repeated the same thing. He was the finance minister at that time. So Mukul Rohatgi, the then Attorney General of India, he said that an individual is not the absolute owner of himself. The state can claim a small ownership right over the individual. Arun Jaitley also said the same thing in parliament and outside, and that had created a lot of controversy, that many libertarian people in India started asking this question in newspaper articles, editorials, etc., that what does the government imply here? What does the government wants to say? Are we living in a medieval society where we are the servant and the government is the owner? Are we slave? No, we are free people living in a free society where government has no right to take our property without our consent. So, on this ground, they challenged the Aadhaar bill, and finally Supreme Court did accept that argument, and you know what happened after that. Now, this is an important thing. There was a question, there was a debate about self ownership, or even in many other cases like homosexuality, for example, adultery, for example, many other cases also self ownership was a topic of discussion in that time. So, there can be some question on this topic in your exam also, that what is self ownership and what are the basis of that. So, you can use this idea and those examples to understand the self ownership here. So, that is the idea of self ownership according to the libertarian principle. Now, next important question is that if liberty is so extreme in this theory, then what is the ground on which human relationship should be based? Because relationship always requires the limitation of the liberty of the individual. Extreme liberty, as we had seen earlier, leads us to the state of nature. So, how can we make a stable and peaceful relationship among each other on the basis of liberty? What can be the legitimate ground of limitation of the liberty in order to enter into a relationship? Let us talk about that next. So, change the paragraph and after write further. Apart from non-aggression, the only other ethical obligation apart from non-aggression, the only other ethical obligation on an individual apart from non-aggression, the only other ethical obligation on an individual is the obligation of consent. An individual, write down further, an individual can restrict his own liberty through his own consent. An individual can restrict his or her own liberty through his own consent. Any other limitation on, write down, any other limitation on individual liberty should be considered as an act of aggression. Any other limitation on the individual liberty should be considered as an act of aggression. So, this is the next important thing. They say that according to the liberty principle, every individual has the complete liberty to do whatever that person wants, but that liberty also includes liberty not to do something else as well. So, I have a right to do everything that I want as an individual, but I have a right to not do something that I do not want, which I can tell everybody else through my own consent. So, through our own consent, we can limit our own liberty. That is the only legitimate ground of the limitation of the liberty of an individual. So, any other limitation on individual liberty apart from consent and non-aggression would be an act of aggression. So, consent is one of the central concept of libertarian principle again, because the idea here is that according to them, every human relationship should be based only and only on the individual consent. If you look at our relationship, most of our relationship in public life today is based on the consent itself. Just look at our relationship in these classrooms. Suppose we are in a physical classroom, you are in front of me. Now, if you are sitting in the classroom physically, then in this classroom, in such a classroom, you don't have much liberty. You do not have the freedom of expression there. For example, if you are talking to each other in a classroom, and if I ask you, please don't talk, then you cannot simply retort back at me saying that, sir, I have the freedom of expression, Article 19(1)(a). So I will go to Supreme Court against you. Cannot can say claim. So inside the classroom, you do not have the freedom of expression. Your liberty is limited. But is that ethically wrong? Can you say that that's a violation of your fundamental right? Of course not. Because your liberty is limited because your own consent. When you took admission in this institute, for example, then you signed on a form. And when you signed on the form, then you agreed that you will maintain certain discipline and decorum in the classroom. Then after, it is your duty to ensure that you maintain that. It's your consent. If you do not want to, if you want to exercise your freedom of expression, for example, then leave the classroom. Outside the classroom, you have all the freedom of expression. But inside the classroom, you do not have the freedom of expression because you were allowed entry into the classroom in a private space only on the ground that you will maintain that thing and you agreed for that. So inside the classroom, you do not have the freedom of expression. Outside the classroom, you have all. Similarly, in this classroom, I also do not have unrestricted freedom of expression. I can speak all the time, but I cannot speak anything that comes to mind. During these 2, 3, 4 hours, I can say in this classroom, well, I can speak only and only about the topics ethics that we are talking about here. I cannot, sitting in a classroom, for example, I cannot start telling you the stories of my life. That in my childhood, I also used to play with the crocodile, for example. So, I cannot start you telling the stories of my life. That will be unethical. Why so? Because I have given my consent to my institute that inside this classroom, I will only talk about ethics and relevant topics. If I speak anything else, then that will be ethically unjustified. That will be against my consent. So, idea is that we are in this classroom according to our consent, and through that our liberty is highly restricted. But that restriction on our liberty inside the classroom is morally justified because it is based on our consent. So, every other limitation that you can talk about, relationship, well, it is based on a mutual consent like that. This is what this theory essentially tells us. Only thing that we are restricted by. So, this is the meaning of the consent. This is how they will say that every relationship in the society should be based only and only on the consent of the individual, on nothing else. There is a question, let us see that. So, right to property removed from fundamental right, is it not hamper our self-ownership? How is justified according to libertarian principle? No, it cannot be justified according to libertarian principle. So, according to libertarian principle, right to property is the most fundamental of all the rights. Every right comes out of that property right itself. So, libertarian will be very strongly against that removal of the right to property. They will say right to property should be not only a fundamental right, it should be the most fundamental of all the rights. But remember, we are not a purely libertarian society. Our constitution has a clause of liberty, but we are not absolutely libertarian society. We follow other principles in our constitution also, which we will talk about in a later class. What are the other principles on which liberty in our country is restricted? So, but yes, if you purely talk about libertarianism, then right to property should not have been removed from the fundamental right. It should be the fundamental right. The most fundamental of all other rights are just a derivative of property right itself. This is what these people will say. Now, come back to the consent here. Now, if you look at the consent here, obligation of consent, then when we talk about consent, then we essentially have two meaning of the term consent. One meaning we often remember, and the other we often forget, and that creates a lots of problems sometimes in our society. So, let us see the meaning of consent here, both the meanings. Write down further. According to them, every individual has the ability to decide every individual has the ability to decide what is right or wrong for himself, for him or her. What is right or wrong for him or her. So if a person decides for something as right, so if a person decides for something as right and gives his consent to it, then it becomes right for him, and he is obligated to do that act. He is obligated to do that act. So this is the first important meaning of the term consent. Now before we talk about this thing, that we have to understand this first line that you have written in this paragraph is very important. Idea here is that libertarian principle is based on this fact, this acceptance that every person in the world is capable of deciding what is right and wrong for that person. This is a very new and radical idea in a way, because earlier it was often thought that majority of the people in the society are extremely poor, uneducated, illiterate, unknowledgeable. Because of that, most of the people cannot decide what is right and what is wrong. Most of the people do not know what is right and wrong. So if people do not know what is right and wrong, then how can decision be taken about morality, what is right and what is wrong? Well, that decision must be taken by the king. So king is capable, king is knowledgeable, king is, you can say, has all the information. So king can take a decision and we should blindly follow that decision. King knows what is right and we do not know what is right, so we should follow what the king tells us to do that. So in philosophy, this idea that king knows everything and we do not know anything, so we must follow the command of the king. In philosophy, this idea is known as paternalism. This idea is known as paternalism. So that this word paternalism is very important. We will talk about paternalism in many class later on also. Now this word paternalism, if you look at it, this word has been derived from the word pater. Pater means what? Pater means father. So this theory, earlier it was assumed in a pre-modern society that, well, king is like the father and we are like the children. Just as in our family, for example, suppose for example, my daughter does not know what is right and wrong. So I as a father always take decision on her behalf and she blindly follows all the decision that I take for her. I am the father, I know everything, and she is a child, she does not know anything. So I must take decision for her and she must follow my decision. That is what is relation with the father and the child. Now earlier it was assumed that king is like a benevolent father and we are like children. King knows everything, we do not know that. So king will take a decision like a benevolent father and we, like an obedient children, well, should follow that decision always. So this idea was known as paternalism. Now libertarians are strongly against any form of paternalism. They say that nobody is a father and nobody is a child. As far as morality is concerned, everybody is capable of deciding what is right and what is wrong. Every individual can know what, if you think about it, you can think about what is right and wrong. So everybody knows, however educated that person may be or uneducated, however rich or however poor that person can be, however illiterate or illiterate that person may be, everybody in the world knows what is right or wrong for that person. So by using, so that knowledge is there, everybody. From where that knowledge comes up, we will talk about that in tomorrow's class in more detail, but in some other theory. But these theory thinkers believe that everybody is capable of knowing what is right and wrong. So by exercising that capability, if a person decides for something as right and takes a decision in favor of that, then that action has become right for him. So, and since it has become right for him, so that person is ethically obligated to do that act. So, consent puts an obligation on the self. What is that obligation? That this action has become right. And since it has become right, then the person must do it. So the moment I gave my consent to something, then that act has become right for me, and it is my duty now to do that act. So that is one important obligation. We must follow our consent. Whatever we have consented to, we are obligated to do that. So that is one important meaning of the consent. But consent has another meaning also. Write down further. Consent also means that others should not make any consent also means that the others should not make any value judgment about others should not make a value judgment about someone's consented act. Others should not make a value judgment about someone's consented act. So that is the next important thing. The idea is that consent has another implicit meaning, that when a person has given consent to something, then other person should not make a value judgment. Consent puts obligation on everybody else also, that others should not make a value judgment about someone's consented act. What is meaning of the term value judgment? Well, value judgment essentially means any judgment about right and wrong. Any judgment about right and wrong. So whenever you make a judgment about right and wrong, then you are making a value judgment. So according to the liberty principle, that when some consent is there, then that action has already become right. Since this action has already become right, so further judgment about right and wrong is infructuous, it is unnecessary, nobody else is capable, nobody else is, you can say, justified in making a further judgment. Nobody else should make a judgment about somebody's act. So that is the second meaning of the term consent here. Now in order to understand this meaning, let's take one small example. So think about that example, a little controversial example in India, but a real case that we are going to talk about will help you to understand what is the consent here. Now this case that I am briefly going to talk about, it was a real case that actually happened in Kerala a few years ago. I hope all of you must be aware of that. A lot of debate has happened in India about that during that period. This case is related to a young girl. Her name was Hadia. You must have heard the Hadia case. Now the case was something like this, that Hadia, there was a young girl, she was born in a Hindu family first of all, and then after she converted to Islam and she married a Muslim man. Then after, some people in her society, including her parents, they started accusing that she has been a victim of the so-called love jihad. That some Muslims brainwashed her and forced her to convert to Islam and marry that man. Now this case went to the Kerala High Court. Now in a very strange judgment from libertarian point of view, the Kerala High Court annulled the marriage first of all, and then after put this girl under the guardianship of her father, legal guardianship of her father. Now from libertarian point of view, this itself was an objectionable act. What is objectionable in that case? Because if you look at this thing again, then in libertarianism, there is an age of consent. There is an age of consent. For most practical purposes in India, it is around 18 years. So age of consent is 18 years, and after that the person is capable of giving consent. Before 18 years of age, the person is not an adult and the person is not capable of giving his or her own consent. So for example, today my daughter is less than 18 years of age. So today she is below the age of consent, she cannot give her consent. So all consent on her behalf is given by me. I am her guardian now, I am a father. So on all the legal documents of my daughter, that her passport, Aadhaar card, or you can say bank account or school document, etc., everywhere my signature is valid. I am her guardian, I am her father. But the day she will turn 18 years of age, then after, well, my signature will no longer valid, her signature will be valid, her consent becomes important after that. She becomes an individual. So after that, I can only work as a guide to her, but not a legal guardian after that. She is an adult, she is an individual then, and then after only she can decide what she wants to do about her life and all. Nobody can force her to go against her own will. So this girl at that point of time, she was already 22 years of age. So at 22 years of age, somebody being put under the guardianship of somebody else by court, that was a violation of libertarian principle. So it was problematic. Then after this case came to the Supreme Court, and then after it became the national news. Then every newspaper wrote articles about that. Some libertarians in India had written an article at that time. Libertarians like you can say the Pratap Bhanu Mehta or Ashutosh Varsne, Faizan Mustafa, Gautam Bhatia, etc. They wrote articles in the newspaper, and in those articles they claimed they suggested what the Supreme Court should be doing. They said the Supreme Court should be doing only three things. First thing that Supreme Court should be doing is that make that girl to be physically present in the courtroom. Physical presence is a very important part of the libertarian principle, habeas corpus as we call it. Bring the body. Body must be present in the courtroom. Physical presence is important, so that girl must be brought to the courtroom, number one. Then after, well, assure her of her safety. Assure her of her safety. A court must assure her that, well, nobody will harm you, nobody will threaten you, you don't have to be afraid of nobody, neither the Hindus nor the Muslims. Nobody will harm you, we are here to protect your safety and security. So don't worry about anything, don't be afraid of. Fear is a bad thing because under threat, if consent is given, then that consent will not be valid. That will be violation of the first principle itself, NAP, non-aggression principle. So threat should not be there. The court must ensure that. Nobody should threaten her, nobody should harm her, nobody should, well, force her to do something. So assure her of her safety, that is second thing. And then after, well, the court should ask her for her consent. Simple, should ask her consent that did you marry this man because of your own choice or not. And if she says yes, that should be the end of the argument. And this is what the court actually did. So after that you can say the girl was actually brought up in the court, then after brought to the court, then after assurance of safety is a normal, you can say implicit thing in a way. Then after court simply asked her, did you marry this man because of your own choice? And she said, yes, I married this man because of my own choice. And then after the case was annulled and her marriage was reinstated and she was allowed to live her life. She is living her life happily after that. Now this is what libertarian will say. That idea is that once the girl says that yes, it is right, I married this man because of my choice, my consent was there, then after nobody else can make a further value judgment, not even the Supreme Court of India. Not even the government of India can make a judgment about her. So individual's judgment about her or his life is the end of the moral argument. So when an individual says that, okay, yes, I did this myself, then after nobody else can make a further judgment, not even the Supreme Court of India. That is the supremacy of the individual, centrality of the individual in the principle of liberty. So that is what is the meaning of the consent. So when the consent is there, then after marriage has become right, and since marriage has become right, then no other judgment is necessary. That is the meaning of that word that I made you to write earlier, that liberty is the absolute end of moral argument. It means that when liberty is established, then no further argument is necessary. All other arguments after that will be an unnecessary argument. So we should not enter into argument after liberty has been there. Only till the point liberty is there, argument is possible. After that, argument should not be there. So this is the meaning of the consent, and that is the meaning of the term absolute liberty. That is one important thing. Now there is another important thing further that we will talk about, another consequence of liberty. Change the paragraph and after write further. They support a completely free market. They support a completely free market with absolutely no government regulation. They support a completely free market with absolutely no government regulation. with absolutely no government regulation. Now, this is the next important consequence of the liberty, that liberty is always based on the existence of a free market. So, they say that market must be completely free. There should not be any interference into the market by the government. Now, next important thing is that if the market, if they support of course free market, but they are not the first people who supported the idea of the free market. Others also earlier talked about the freedom of market. Like for example, all of you must have heard about such people like Adam Smith, considered to be the father of the free market economy. So Smith also talked about freedom of market, and we are also talking about the freedom of market. So what is the difference between Smith's freedom of market and our freedom of market here? There is a fundamental difference. I hope all of you are aware of the basic argument of Adam Smith. You might have studied that in your NCERT textbook of 9th 10th class itself. So some ideas are often presented by given to us during the school days itself, but let's briefly talk about. Adam Smith said that market must be free. But why should market be free? Market should be free because in a free market, everybody will be able to fulfill his or her self-interest. So that is the first important thing. Second important thing about free market will be that in a free market, well, in free market always increases the economic efficiency. Free market always increases the economic efficiency. Always increases the economic efficiency. Now, what is the meaning of term economic efficiency and why does it increase? Well, suppose for example, think of it. Smith has given similar arguments, such arguments. Suppose for example, market is completely free, there is no government regulation. Then, well, we all are selfish people, so I want to earn maximum profit in that market. So, in order to earn good profit, suppose I start a business. Suppose I start manufacturing pen that you are writing with. Now, in order to have maximum profit, I will try to find every possible way to reduce the cost of production. So, slowly what will happen, that the cost of production will automatically become minimum. So, that will be one consequence of free market. Everybody will try to find out maximum way, best possible way to minimize the cost of production. Cost of production will become minimum. Not only that, the quality of product will always become maximum. Why so? Because in order to increase my profit, I will always try to, of course, in order to have maximum profit, I will like that, I will of course want that my pen should be bought by a large number of people. But why would people buy my pen? Only when the quality of product will be higher. So, in order to sell my product to the large number of people and to gain maximum profit, I will find every possible way to increase the quality of my product. So, quality will automatically will become maximum. Not only that, he will say that in a free market, the price of the product will always be optimum. The price of the product will always be optimum. Why? How come so? Just think of it. Suppose for example, as a selfish person, in order to gain maximum profit, suppose I increase the price of my product to a very high level. If I increase the price of my product to a very high level, then somebody else in the society will also think that, wow, it is such a lucrative business. So, well, that person will also start manufacturing the same pen because, well, he will see that high profit is there. Now, then after, in order to sell his pen to consumers, well, he will reduce the price of his product slightly lesser than my price. Then after, in order to sell my product, I will further reduce my price. There will be competition between me and my competitor in that case, and at the end of it, we will settle at a point at a price which is beneficial for me also, my competitor also, and the consumers also. Price will become optimum. So, he said that in a free market economy, cost of production is always minimum, quality maximum, and price minimum. Combined together, these three things are called economic efficiency. So, he has said, you must have heard the famous quotation of Adam Smith. He had said that if the government regulation is removed from the market, then market creates its own regulatory framework, well, which which he called invisible hand of the market. That famous phrase used by Adam Smith. that market will create its own invisible hand which will manage everything in such a manner that the cost of production will become minimum, quality of product will become maximum, and price of the product will become optimum. So this is what he called the economic efficiency. So Adam Smith also said that a free market economy is the most efficient economy. Is the max. Any interference by the government into the free market will always reduce the efficiency of the market. So in order to increase the efficiency of the market, government must be removed. So the market will create its own invisible hand, which will create a better regulation. Government regulation will become unnecessary in that case. Government regulation always create artificial hindrance in the invisible hand or functioning of the market. So that is the meaning of the term economic efficiency. And not only that, he further said that in a free market you can say that it will increase the social welfare as well. Free market economy also will increase the social welfare in the sense that in this free market you can say most of the people will become happier. Why people will become happier? Because majority of the people in a free market will be able to afford high quality and low price product. Because of that, most of the people can be happier because they can afford high quality product at a lower price. Just think of it. Look at India for last 30 years after liberalization. And market was a little freed. So after that you can say today you can say even the lower class people also can very easily afford a smartphone also. I remember in the 90s even a landline phone was a luxury among the people, even among the middle class people, upper middle class people. Today a smartphone also is a common place, even the lower class people can easily afford. Go to a slum area also, people can afford their motorcycle for example, bike for example, or fridge or cooler, washing machine. So all these products which was earlier luxury, now almost everybody in the society can very easily afford. Even lower middle class people can afford a car, lower class people can also afford a bike today. So because of the freedom of market where easy finance is available, and high quality, low price product is there. So because of all these things, he will say that free market economy will increase social welfare. So he claimed that free market economy is not only the most efficient economy, but it is also the happiest economy. So these are the benefits of free market, and on that ground, Adam Smith supported the freedom of market. So this is what he did. Now if you look at this argument here, then you can appreciate that this argument essentially is a utilitarian argument. So it is a utilitarian argument in the sense because he is supporting the freedom of market on the ground of the utility consequence. Remember, as I told you earlier, that whenever you support something for the sake of something else, then you are essentially becoming a utilitarian person. So this is what, so Adam Smith, though he was still talking about like Mill, who talked about liberty, but he was utilitarian. Adam Smith was also talking about free market, but he was still a utilitarian philosopher. His argument was still a utilitarian argument. And this argument also suffers from the same problem that any other utilitarian argument suffers from. So suppose for example, if you are talking to Adam Smith and he tells us that we should have all these things, these are the benefits of free market. Suppose I tell him that Mr. Smith, I will give you all these benefits without liberty also, without free market also, then can we compromise the freedom of market? He might possibly say yes. If in theoretical condition, that can be done, but not according to libertarian. This is where the libertarians differ from even Adam Smith. So write down further, but they support the freedom of market, but they support the freedom of market not on the ground of economic efficiency, but they support freedom of market not on the ground of economic efficiency, but in the name of human freedom and liberty. but in the name of freedom and liberty. But in the name of freedom and liberty. So that is the next important thing, that so they say that freedom of market is important, but not because it is going to be beneficial for the society. It is important because, so freedom of market is important not because my activity in the free market is going to benefit the society. Market should be free because, well, as an individual, I should have a right to do whatever I want. There should not be any restriction on my economic activity. It may create benefit, but even if the freedom of market is creating chaos in the society, it reduces the economic efficiency in the society, then also freedom of market is so important that it cannot be compromised. This is what libertarians will say. So according to them, the market freedom is one of the essential, economic freedom is the essential aspect of freedom. Without economic freedom, all other freedom is meaningless. So economic freedom is the root of all other freedom. Without that, other freedoms are meaningless in a way. You must ensure economic freedom at any cost. That's why, so economic freedom is a very important part of the overall freedom of a person. That's why we often say that when we talk about women's empowerment, then we often say that, well, first important thing that we have to ensure in order to empower our women, that they should be economically independent. If they are economically not independent, they are dependent on their parents or their husband or their family for the economic sustenance, all other freedom will be meaningless. So freedom can be exercised only and only when there is economic sufficiency. So that is the importance. So they are strongly in support of the idea of the economic freedom, market freedom, in that financial freedom maybe. So that is one important thing that libertarians further talk about. And then last one more thing further, write down, change the paragraph and then after write further. They support a minimum government. They support a minimum government in which the government should be ethically allowed to perform only two functions. Government should be ethically allowed to perform only two functions. So this is the next important thing. The idea here is that these people will say that they are a strong supporter of a minimum government. Today you know that today government does many things, but according to these people, everything else that the government is doing will be unethical. There are only two things that can be done by the government which will be consistent with the idea of liberty. So except for these two things that we are going to briefly talk about next, well, everything else that the government does should be stopped. Government should not. Minimum government is one of the most important plank, most important demand of the libertarians. It is because of this thing, you know, that 10 years ago people supported Narendra Modi, many libertarians supported Narendra Modi as a desirable prime minister. Because Modi often used to say in his rallies that my motto is, well, minimum government and maximum governance. So whenever a politician uses this term minimum government, then libertarians often become very happy with that politician. They start imagining or thinking that, well, now our policies will be implemented. So minimum government is one of the most important things that you can say these people demand. Now what is the meaning of the term minimum government? Let's talk about that, and we'll also see to what extent Modi government has been able to fulfill the promise of minimum government. Let us talk about that next. So write down further two things. Only two things can be done by the government. First one is, write down, to enforce the contract between consenting adults. to enforce the contract between the consenting adults. Write down a few lines. It is not the job of the government. It is not the job of the government to judge the fairness of a contract. It is not the job of the government to judge the fairness of a contract. Any contract, write down further, any contract just because of the fact, that it has been entered into, by consenting adults. It has been entered into by consenting adults, comma, it is fair, and the government should only enforce it. And the government should only enforce it. So, this is the first important thing that the government should be doing. The idea here is that contract. If you look at contract, for example, let's talk about a little contract. If you look at contract between any two people, then every contract had, two components. First component is the judgment component. When you make a judgment about a contract, what is the judgment? Judgment basically means that we judge whether the contract is fair or unfair. And second aspect of a contract is enforcement of a contract. Now, according to these people, libertarians, judgment of a contract is not the job of the government. Who can make a judgment about a contract? Well, only an individual can make a judgment. Remember, judgment is always done by the individual. Consent, liberty. So, judgment can be done only and only by the individual. So, how do you know whether the contract is fair or unfair? According to them, only one criteria is there. If the contract is based on the consent, it is fair, and if the consent is not there, it is unfair. So, that is the only criteria to judge the fairness of a contract, whether it is based on the consent or not. Take the case of that Hadia that we talked about earlier, or before that. So judgment is about consent, which makes it fair, lack of consent, which makes it unfair. So, only this thing that government can do. So, this is not job of the government. Judgment of a contract is not job of the government. Well, enforcement of a contract is. So, government should only enforce a contract without make any fair contract based on consent must be enforced by the government. Government should not make a judgment whether the contract is fair or not. Take the case of Hadia again. Now, in this case, marriage was a contract there. Now, in this case, marriage was fair or unfair. How did you decide? Well, consent was the criteria. So, Supreme Court established the consent. If the consent was there, then marriage was fair. And then after, what is the job of the government? To enforce the contract. So, then after, it is the job of the government to ensure that nobody should harm that couple. Nobody should stop that person from living their life in the way they want. And though both of them cannot leave each other also. That is a contract, marriage. So, they should not cheat each other, they should not harm each other, and nobody else should harm them as well. That is what is to be ensured by the government. So, judgment of a contract is not job of the government. Well, fair enforcement of the contract is. That is the job of the government. So, now in order to understand a judgment and enforcement, let's take one more practical. Hadia is one example that we already saw. A second example also we can take. Suppose, for example, think of it. Suppose, for example, there are two people, say A and B. Now, A is a rich businessman and B is a poor worker. Now, A is a rich businessman. In his office, in his factory, he has a vacancy. He is looking for a worker. And suppose B is that worker who can do his job. He is the one who has the required ability, required skill, required expertise, required experience, and he is also looking for a job. So, in a way, both of them fit into each other's need. He is looking for a worker. he has the work, he is that worker. He has a vacancy and he can fill the vacancy. They fill into each other's need, but there is asymmetry into their situation. Asymmetry is that this rich businessman, he is not very desperate for the worker. He can wait for a week, a month also. This person on the other hand, he is desperate for a job. So desperate he is that for last 3 months he is not having any job. For last 2 days, no food has been cooked in his family. Situation is so, there's some medical emergency. Well, situation is so bad that he must get a job today itself. If he does not get a job today, then tomorrow something very unfortunate will happen in his life. That is the second condition. Desperate for it. He just wants to have a job. That's it. And third fact is that this person, on the basis of the prevailing marketing condition, suppose he deserves a salary of rupees 500 per day. But this person knows how desperate he is. So he makes an offer to him that I will give you this job, but I will give you only 100 rupees as a salary. And I will give you this job only when you agree to work at least for a month on that salary. If you, after 1 month, we can renegotiate the salary, we can talk. But at least for a month as an apprentice, you have to work at least for a month for 100 rupees per day. This person is so desperate that he has no other choice, so he accepts that offer and he gives his consent and signs on the contract and starts working for him. Now after 1 week, suppose his immediate needs are over and he gets a better offer somewhere else. And after that, he breaks the contract, he tells him, no, I am not going to work for you, you are paying too less for me. Saying that, he walks out. And this person goes to the government saying that this person has broken his contract, please punish him. Now, do you know, what do you think, that whom should the government punish in that case? Who is doing the wrong? A or B? Or other, what do you think government in India will do in such a case? Now in India, if you know the Indian law, then in India, this person will be punished by the government. Why so? Because this person has violated a law in India. What is that law? That law is the minimum wage law. So in India, for most of the state, minimum wage is around 250 rupees or so. So he is paying him less than minimum wage, 100 rupees. So he has violated the law, and for that reason, government will punish this person rather than that person. But libertarian will say, no, that is wrong. Libertarian will say that government has no locus standi to make such a law like minimum wage law. They will say, we'll talk about that later on also further. But minimum wage law is an unethical law according. Who is the government to decide what is minimum wage and what is maximum wage? Minimum wage and maximum wage can be decided only by the individual. So minimum wage can be something else for me and it can be something else for somebody else. So on what ground can government decide what is minimum and what is maximum? Only individual is capable to take decision about what wage he wants to have. Nobody else can force on that. So according to them, only thing that the government should do is that did this person, to ensure that did this person force him to work for that salary? Did he put a pistol on his head and ask him to sign on that contract? If yes, then this contract was invalid. It was based on force. But if there is no force, simply he made an offer and he accepted that offer, that is the end of the argument. And government must enforce that contract. Government must force this second person to work for him at least for a month according to the contract. So that is the meaning of this thing, that government should not make a judgment about a contract, only the enforcement of the contract. Key word here is the consenting adults. So any contract between consenting adult is fair. Government should not interfere into that. Only enforce that. This is the first thing that the government should be doing. And the second thing that the government should be doing is, write down further, to ensure non-aggression. To ensure non-aggression. So second thing that the government should do is to ensure non-aggression principle. So that is next. And remember, non-aggression means again those two things, physical harm or violation of the property right of somebody. So non-aggression principle should be ensured. So that is the second important thing that the government should be doing. Change the paragraph, then after write further. All other government actions are all other government actions are wrong because all other government actions are wrong because they violate the individual liberty, and thus are ethically unjustified. And thus they are ethically unjustified. So this is what they, so except for these two things, anything else that the government is doing would be unethical according to them. So in a way we can say, they say that only two things can be done by the government. In a more simple language, government should ensure that in the society there should not be any cheating and there should not be any violence. So no cheating and no violence. That is the only thing that the government should be ensuring in the society. Nothing else should be done by the government. Cheating should be prevented, violence should be prevented. If you want to combine both of them together, no cheating and no violence, then one single thing that can be done by the government. And we say that as only thing that the government, only one thing that the government should be doing is the protection of individual liberty. Protection of the individual liberty. So this is the only thing that the government should be doing. And remember, I am going to use this word a number of times in my later classes, protection of individual liberty. And remember, when I use this term protection of individual liberty, then I mean those two things, no cheating and no violence. So idea here is that the moment government, whenever the government is trying to make a law, government must ask this question: what is the purpose of that law? If the purpose of the law is to prevent cheating, that is an ethical law. If the purpose of the law is to prevent violence in the society, that is a moral law. But if any other purpose is there, then that will be an immoral law, that will be a bad law. So now we get the second criteria of lawmaking. First criteria of lawmaking that we had talked about in yesterday's class was Bentham's criteria. What do you think Bentham will say about lawmaking? What's the purpose of the law? According to Bentham, purpose of the law was to maximize the happiness in the society. So Bentham said that law must always try to maximize the happiness in the society. But now we say, according to libertarians, that no, happiness is not job of the government. Government should not try to maximize the happiness. So government should not try to make us happier. Happiness is our individual project. Government should not try to make us happier. In fact, government cannot make us happier. Can anybody else make you happy forcefully? Suppose, for example, I put a pistol on your head and ask you, be happy, otherwise I'll kill you. Would you be happy in that case? Of course not. Happiness cannot be created like that. You know, there is a famous quotation of Stalin, Joseph Stalin. He had said that, well, if you want to make a happy society, then kill all the unhappy people. Now, can you make the happy society by killing unhappy people? That is a problematic thing. So you cannot make people happy forcefully. Happiness is a personal project. Let people decide whether they want to become happy or not. Government should not interfere into the happiness. Happiness is the individual of effort. Government should only ensure protection of individual liberty. You know, if you look at, there is a beautiful political and moral document is there, American Declaration of Independence. I hope that some of you may have heard about that. American Declaration of Independence begins with this line. I will talk about this line in a later class, more detail. But it begins with this line that we take this as self-evident truth. You'll see the meaning of self-evident truth later on. We take this as self-evident truth that all men are created equal. We'll talk about this also in a later class. That all men are created equal and they are endowed by their creator certain inalienable rights, which includes right to life, liberty, and the third one is very important. Interesting. Third one is the pursuit of happiness. So we take this as again quoting it, we take this as self-evident truth that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their creator, the God, certain inalienable rights, which includes the right to life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Now, pursuit of happiness is an interesting thing. This is consistent with the idea of liberty. So, happiness is not something that the government can ensure. Pursuit of happiness is something that the government can ensure. So, idea is that government cannot make me happy, force me to become happy. Government must only ensure that, well, if I want to become happy, then nobody should stop me from that. I must be able to pursue my means of happiness. Nobody should stop me from that. But after that, whether I pursue my means of happiness or not, that is my liberty. Government should not force me to do something and then be happy. No, it's my choice. But pursuit of happiness must be ensured by the government. So that is what the government should be doing. You know, there is a beautiful film also with the same name, Pursuit of Happiness. I might suggest you sometimes if you get the time, you can watch that. Will Smith, beautiful film. So that is what liberty should be there. So according to them, government should not make people happy. Government should only ensure the pursuit of happiness. Government should only ensure the protection of individual liberty, which means these two things, that enforcement of the contract between consenting adult, which means no cheating, and assurance of the non-aggression, which means no violence. So except for these two things, everything else that the government is doing would be unethical. Now, next important question that comes up is that if these two are the only thing that the government should be doing, then what are the other things that the government is doing in today's time which according to them is unethical? We will talk about those things in tomorrow's class. So, tomorrow we will talk about what are the unethical things that the government is doing which the government should stop doing. That we will talk about in tomorrow's class. So, that is it for today. See you tomorrow.